Good evening, everybody. Good morning as well, depending on what part of the globe you are. We are doing our first speaker series tonight for PMU WFSF speaker series. So we'll have more speakers coming throughout the term, but tonight is our first. Tonight is Dr. Thomas Lombardo, and he is the director of the Center for Future Consciousness, the editor of Future Consciousness Insights, the executive board member of the World Future Studies Federation, and he has several books. Some of those include Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution, The Pursuit of Virtue, and the science fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. So he's joining us tonight from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm going to hand over just a brief moment.
Is that I think Crystal was going to say something else and she was muted out. Is that correct?
Well, I was going to just say that we're grateful for having you tonight in coming, because we rescheduled with you for tonight from last time. So we appreciate you taking the time to come again for us to be the first guest speaker.
Yes, well, thank you, Crystal, and it's good to be here. So I saw that. I thought you were going to say something more, but okay, all right. So I am going to share my screen. Now, can you see Center for Future Consciousness? And can you hear me? Good. Okay, so we will begin. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo, and the Center for Future Consciousness produces two different items up here on the screen: Future Consciousness Insights, which is a newsletter which you can subscribe to by going to the website. And we also have a video school, which, if you're interested, after the presentation today, contains much more extensive presentations on the history of science fiction. Here's a number of my books on the study of the future, future consciousness, virtue. The ones that I am going to be highlighting today in my talk are the three below, my series on science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future. To move from there, the mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. The talk I'm giving today is Science Fiction and the Evolution of Future Consciousness. I have a quote up here from John Clute, who's one of the most significant historians.
Dr. Thomas?
You're on mute.
Am I off mute now?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, how long have I been on mute?
Just for a second.
Okay, here.
There's a glitch with the muting button in Zoom. Sorry about that.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, the talk I'm giving today is Science Fiction and the Evolution of Future Consciousness. And I have up here a quote from John Clute, who is one of the premier historians and theorists on science fiction in the world. Everything else is looking more like science fiction, and science fiction is looking more like everything else. Well, we have another glitch. Oh, there we go. This is my outline today. I noticed on your class schedule that your opening class was going to be on the history of future studies, whereas today I'm going to be talking on the history of science fiction. As I'm going to explain as we go along, it is very relevant to understand the history of science fiction if one is going to understand the history of future studies. In fact, it's critical. I'll include a little bit about the history of future studies throughout the presentation, but what I'm going to be emphasizing is the importance of science fiction in its history. I'm going to briefly look at the idea of future consciousness as a starting point, what future consciousness is, how it evolved from its ancient origins. Then I'll go into a bit on modern Western science and philosophy and identify the beginnings of modern science fiction in the 17th and 18th centuries. Then I'll go through a history of science fiction from the 19th century up to the present, connecting science fiction with what has been going on within human society. I'll summarize talking about the nature, breadth, and influence of science fiction and why I call science fiction the evolutionary mythology of the future. And at the end, we can discuss, as part of our dialogue, what is the value of science fiction in understanding the future and guiding us toward the future. To begin, future consciousness. And what I'm drawing from here is my book, Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution. I define future consciousness, which we all possess as a normal human capacity, the total holistic and integrative set of all psychological processes and modes of experience and behavior involved in our consciousness of the future. It includes our emotions, such as fear and hope, our motivations and goals, our thinking and imagination about the future, and even our personal identity. Future consciousness is a term that covers everything about the conscious human mind that pertains to the future. And it's something we all possess, and it's a necessary thing that we all possess. In fact, future consciousness as our most empowering and distinctive human capacity, which has driven or drove the purposeful evolution of human society and the human conscious mind. That is, future consciousness is what has created the modern mind and created modern human civilization. That is, our capacity to set goals, to imagine the future, to plan, to create technologies, all of that is a consequence, a result of future consciousness. And science fiction has a unique and increasingly powerful role in the ongoing purposeful evolution of future consciousness, because our future consciousness indeed is evolving, and it's in fact facilitating our very evolution. At this point, I'm just going to draw a couple items off of my book, The Evolution of Future Consciousness, The Nature and Historical Development of the Human Capacity to Think About the Future. I have a quote up here from Anthony Redding. The history of civilization is essentially a history of mankind's increasing ability to predict the future. Another quote from Leonard Shlain, who is a theorist and writer on human psychology and human sociology. The entire history of life on this planet could be conceived of as a striving by life forms to attain an ever greater appreciation of the vectors of space and time. And basically what that means is that Shlain is arguing that if we observe the evolution of intelligence, of intelligent abilities, and of consciousness within life, and in particular animal life, what we're observing, or what we do observe, is a growing awareness of greater and greater expanses of space and time. That is, the most primitive form of life is going to be focused on simply the immediate here and now, whereas across evolution, what we find is an increasing awareness and capacity to deal with things at a distance from us in both space and time. There's an interesting picture up here that came out of National Geographic in the middle there of an attempted reconstruction of what a Neanderthal woman looked like 30, 40,000 years ago. I also have a couple other pictures up there representing our ancient heritage, including image of the famous Venus goddess. Now, when people think about our ability to predict, to understand the future, they usually will say it's something that has particularly emerged in the last few centuries. The counter argument is that actually our capacity to be aware of the future has been evolving in us for millions of years. Up here, you can see a diagram of the changes in the skull shape of ourselves going back to Australopithecus, where the frontal areas of the brain are obviously enlarging across time over the last 3.5 million years, which particularly deal with planning and foresight. Up there is a cover of a book, Evolution's Arrow, in which the argument is made that our temporal and spatial range of adaptability has been expanding across time and indicates what the arrow of evolution is, toward increasing adaptability to greater vistas and vectors in space and time. Going back all the way to hunters and gatherers, our ancient or prehistoric origins, foresight and purposeful behavior was manifested even then in terms of people being able to predict the movements of prey, hunting animals, the creation of strategies among humans to corner and animals to throw spears. Spear throwing is in fact a future-oriented capacity. There's a picture of a Homo erectus up here with the spear. When we began to control fire, that was a case of future consciousness, being able to manipulate fire. Tools and artifacts and habitats are examples of purposeful creativity geared toward accomplishing something in the future. A tool is an instrument that is used to have an effect in the future. And that's an example of future consciousness. Our bonding together, parenting, negotiating relationships for parenting with each other, making commitments, all of that is another example of future consciousness. And this goes back tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. Our art creating thinking spaces in which we created pictorial narratives, are dealing with death, the burial of death, agriculture, cities, religion, ethics, astrology, trade, conquest. In fact, all of these are examples of future consciousness in our prehistoric times. In fact, Stewart argues, and I'll come back to this in a while, that the ideal adapter in evolution is somebody or something which is conscious and is able to control the process of evolution. And in fact, we do that through our capacity for future consciousness, by thinking out ahead and manipulating change, because we can move our minds past the immediate here and now. We don't simply react, rather we create and we guide and direct. And that's all future consciousness. Now, somewhere 10,000 years ago, perhaps, maybe more, a new dimension of future consciousness became prominent, which was the mythic narrative. And mythic narratives are something pervasive throughout all human cultures, in which people created stories involving deities and powerful beings that were responsible for the origin and the destiny and purpose of humanity. And just to highlight a few things, more things about myth. There's a deep history of us telling and recording mythic tales. Myths are stories or narratives. Myths frequently involve the far reaches of human imagination. That is, in myths, we are able to go beyond the immediate here and now. Whereas a heritage of extraordinary adventures into the unknown in myths, fantastic beings, otherworldly, higher supernatural realms with cosmic explanations and events and cosmic beings. And in fact, insofar as we thought animistically in our myths, we saw the heavens as personified and filled with deities. In fact, we saw nature as enchanted and filled with personae. So myths involve personified characters and forces that were extraordinary and cosmic, and often contained end-of-the-world prophecies beyond the here and now. So myths manifest future consciousness in that we're thinking about where is it all going, the ultimate purpose and direction of things. And myths involve a belief, a theory of the nature of reality, of what was seen as the credible transcendent beyond the immediate here and now. And they provided meaning and explanation and purpose and value. People live by myths and continue to live by myths. In fact, myths share a great deal with science fiction because the origins of science fiction can be found in myth. Here's a list of qualities of myth, which I drew from Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth and Carl Jung and his work on myths, plus some other resources. And notice that myths contain personifications or narratives, have an emotional, motivational dimension, or ethical, prescriptive. They engage in the aesthetic or art. They involve immersive participation. There's often icons, symbols. They involve holistic consciousness. They deal with the fantastic and transcendent. And one of the things I realize is that this list of qualities of myth are all contained in science fiction. The same qualities. The difference, as I will explain in a bit, is that ancient myths depended upon a theory of reality from ancient times, whereas science fiction, still having all the other qualities, depends on a theory of reality which derives from modern times and science. Science fiction, in fact, is the literature of the mythic imagination, which grew out of ancient myths that involve fantastical adventures, but dealt with the ultimate purpose and meaning and origin of life. Now, if we look into the early years of recorded civilization, we find some really good examples of both mythic and, in fact, philosophical, theological visions of the future, beginning with Zoroaster and the image of Armageddon and the apocalypse. In fact, Zoroaster and his theory of the future has been very influential throughout Western civilization, at least. The revelation of St. John about the end of the world and the battle between Satan and the forces of God, containing fantastical imagery of the future, St. Augustine's utopian city of God and millennialism, and Augustine's vision of how humanity would be transformed, transmuted, and transcended. And in fact, in the 13th century AD, we find the Theologus Autodidacticus by Ibn al-Nafas, which is a combination of theology and futuristic science fiction. So throughout the Middle Ages, we find plenty of examples of stories and theories about the future in various different cultural traditions. But when we come up to the 16th and 17th century, we have a revolution in thinking. We have the scientific transformation of nature and the heavens, in which a new theory of reality and knowledge emerges. A theory of reality and knowledge which would challenge the religious and theological and ancient mythic views on reality. And in particular, it was built upon the idea that through reason and observation and mathematics and technological instruments, we could understand nature, and nature did not necessarily contain in it any kind of personified beings that were responsible for nature. Rather, it was scientific laws. Now, this was not a clear break with Western religion. In fact, all of the early scientists still believed and subscribed to Christian visions of reality. The one up there who probably broke away most from the traditional religious theory of reality and knowledge was Spinoza, the gentleman who has the mustache with the dark, long black hair. And Spinoza was a 17th century philosopher who pretty much did away with the theological underpinnings of Western Christianity and was a believer in science and in reason, etc. But science was providing a different theory of reality than the theory of reality that ancient myths were based upon. Now, around this time, we began to see utopian visions, like Sir Thomas More's Utopia, Tommaso Campanella's The City of the Sun, and Francis Bacon's The New Atlantis. Couple comments. Now, these are being written around the same time that the scientific revolution has taken off, is that More and Campanella both felt that their ideal visions of human society were something that could be realized in the actual world. So they were presenting utopian visions that they thought had practical value. They were prescriptions for the future. Bacon's The New Atlantis was very significant as a utopia because in The New Atlantis, he described a whole slew of different technological developments that could be realized based upon the scientific method that would make for a much better society than the kind of society we live in today. So Bacon's utopia is a techno-scientific empowered utopia. Now, Bacon still was a Christian believer, and I can't go into the details of how he reconciled the two, but Bacon gives us probably the most noteworthy early scientific technological utopia that came in around the time of the scientific revolution, and Bacon was one of the key architects of the scientific revolution. Now, following on the heels of the scientific revolution, we have the Western European Enlightenment. And I have a quote up here: "Thus we surpass all the times that have been before us, and it is highly probable that those that will succeed will far surpass us." That is, excuse me, we see the image of progress, the image that through knowledge, we can gain power over the world and make the world a better place to live in. And the Enlightenment had a number of different features to it, including it was a secular challenge to religious authority, in that it was through science and reason, not through sacred texts and religious figures, that we would understand truth and reality, that we would base society on reason and on observation, rationalism, empiricism, that if we applied science to industry, we can improve the world, that there would be an ongoing growth of knowledge as a consequence of applying reason, observation, and science, that there should be equality of all humans, and that there should be human rights for everybody. The belief in secular progress is that our Material natural world indeed can improve and can continue to improve. In fact, humanity can improve. And Condorcet, whose image is up there, who was one of the great architects of the Enlightenment, definitely believed that through education and through secular knowledge, we can improve humanity. So we have material economic growth and well-being, and finally we have the belief in liberty, freedom, democracy, and individualism, which comes out of the Enlightenment too. And all of these factors are going to play into the emergence of science fiction in modern times. But right after the Enlightenment, we get a reaction to the Enlightenment. And this is the other important piece. We get Romanticism and the Gothic, which emerges as a complex philosophy, a movement in art in the latter part of the 18th century and into the 19th century. It's a strong attack on the belief in scientific truth and secular progress. And indeed, it grows out of the Dionysian heritage of the Greeks. And it's a heritage you could probably find in other cultures as well as the ancient Greeks. And it has to do with the meaning of life. The question is, through science and reason, can we create the good life, or are we missing something? And secondly, when we look at how industrial technological progress is transforming the world, does it look like a good thing? Are we losing our individuality freedom? Are we losing contact with nature? In fact, what Romanticism brings up is the centrality and importance of human emotion. Reason is not enough to provide meaning and purpose in life. Sturm und Drang, which means storm and drive and stress, was a literary movement in Germany which emphasizes intense emotionality. And the Gothic emerged as a form of literature which emphasized horror, mystery, madness, and diabolism and the supernatural. And so Romanticism brings up the contrast. Is our hero the artist? Is our hero the scientist? And Romanticism emphasizes creativity. So Romanticism in the Gothic is a second philosophical movement besides science and enlightenment that would impact in the evolution of science fiction. In fact, the first story written in which there are concrete characters having experiences in a narrative form that takes place in the future is The Last Man, written right around the beginning of the 19th century. And it's a story about the end of the world. And it's a story combining, believe it or not, humanity exhausting its resources, which is what we're talking about today, plus a theological and spiritual elements working itself into it. So this is the first time somebody really tries to create a narrative of the future, where the characters go through different experiences. This is a exceedingly romantic, depressive novel. Indeed, I think it's the most depressing novel I ever read. And very soon afterward, the author, Cousin de Granville, committed suicide. But it's worth reading to see how depressed someone could get over the future, which of course resonates with how a lot of people are today. But was the real famous one that emerged around the same time, which was definitely romantic and Gothic, was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Now, Shelley called it the modern Prometheus as a subtitle because Prometheus was the Greek mythic figure who had stolen fire from the gods and had given it to humanity, thus empowering humanity to determine their own destiny. That is, humanity could take control of their own lives and their own existence. We could play God. We didn't need the gods up above anymore. Frankenstein, the doctor, the scientist in the novel, believes that he can create life, that is to play God. And Frankenstein, the doctor, does create out of an amalgamation of body parts, this animated being, but the story is very anti-scientific. It's very anti-human empowerment. Frankenstein the Doctor becomes immediately guilty and neurotically obsessed over what he has done. And in the end, he dies for it, or probably dies for it, along with his wife. So this is very anti-scientific, almost anti-science fiction. And it's very psychological. There's very little technology, and it's mostly about the states of mind of Frankenstein the Doctor. But very soon thereafter, as far as I'm aware, the first narrative of future human society, 2 centuries ahead, involving concrete characters with both scientific technological extrapolations and social ethical psychological extrapolations, and written by another woman, Jane Loden, was published. The Mummy. Now, the Mummy in the 21st century, and in the 20th century too, is associated with horror and with the Gothic and with spooky tales, et cetera, But the original Mummy, this novel, the mummy in it, who is a reanimated Egyptian pharaoh, is actually the good guy in the story. But the significant thing in here is that Loden makes a set of predictions about the 22nd century, and she tells a story which revolves around those predictions. And so this clearly captures the spirit of science fiction, and it provides a narrative of the future. So between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, we see that science fiction is going to emerge with a double-edged sword. On one hand, we could have hope and wonder about the future, which derives off of the Enlightenment and reason and science, or we could have fear and terror about the future, which derives off of Romanticism and emphasizing the emotional. And indeed, down here I have a quote from Ortega y Gasset: "Since man is above all future making, he is above all a swarm of hopes and fears." And indeed, when we think about science fiction and we want to highlight out its future-oriented quality as well as its emotional quality, we see that science fiction is a combination of hope and wonder about the future plus fear and terror about the future. Now, the next significant element to emerge in a history of thought, which will impact science fiction, is the theory of evolution. In the center there, we have a quote from James Hutton. "We see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end." And Hutton is the father of modern geology, who scientifically demonstrated that the Earth is much more than 6,000 years old, and it's continually in a process of transformation. That is, the world around us is not static, but the world around us is transforming. Hooke, who's up there next to the fossil remains of a trilobite and a plesiosaur, clearly demonstrated that there were animals that had lived on the Earth that don't live anymore. Thus, the animal kingdom is not static. Herschel on the right with the planet Uranus, which he discovered, demonstrated that the heavens were transforming. Immanuel Kant down below on the right-hand side argued that the entire cosmos was evolving. And Lamarck down in the middle next to the giraffes presented the first scientific theory of the evolution of life. Even though he believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which people afterwards rejected, he did present a scientific theory of evolution. So evolution, which emerges in the 19th century, sees pervasive change. The world is, and the universe is not static, sees deep time both into the past and into the future. And this is an ongoing development in the history of thinking, which clearly is going to have an impact on science fiction. Darwin, who was associated with the theory of evolution, contradicted static creationism from evolution, and the clockwork universe from Newton, arguing that reality was transformative and was not something like a static entity or something that just simply keeps repeating itself over and over again. The origin of species, he provided a naturalistic explanation of life with no purposeful design. But he believed that evolution entailed progress from the simple to the complex. In The Descent of Man, he applied this to humans and to social history. And he provided, therefore, a cosmic narrative of the past and the future. And the theory of evolution became the overarching framework for scientific plausibility as we moved toward the end of the 19th century. But it implied that the future was uncertain and humanity had no special position in it. So who knows what will happen to humanity? It's transforming nature, but who knows what's going to happen to us? It appears to me that right after Darwin, science fiction explodes. That is, the number of science fiction stories increased tremendously. One of the most famous and influential that came out the same year as The Descent of Man is Will, the Power of the Coming Race, in which we find cyborgs, that is, beings who are biological with technological devices hooked onto them that empower them. And we find beings who are living below the surface of the earth, who are superior to us, both mentally and physically, and threaten our very existence. And this became a very famous novel, and it envisions the whole idea that things beyond humanity may evolve or transcend us, and that we can couple together with our technologies, which will empower us further. 10 years later, Albert Robita, and by the way, all of those diagrams up there, those pictures, he drew. Not only was he a great writer of science fiction, he was the first great science fiction artist. And Robita envisioned in the 20th century, which is a very significant novel written toward the end of the 19th century, future Paris. And here's a quote from him: "Overwrought, wired up, frightfully busy and nervous, life in the electrical age, we must admit, has overtaxed the human race and brought about a kind of universal degeneration." And the 20th century is an extremely intricate narrative about future humanity, done very well with very comical and interesting characters. And I highly recommend it as one of the best science fiction novels written in the 19th century, where capitalism, the emancipation of women, manipulating the environment, actually moving the moon and other things takes place in the story. And very, very funny, but it's ambiguous regarding this is a good thing or not, all of this science and technology. The first American science fiction bestseller was written by John Jacob Astor, who died on the Titanic, A Journey in Other Worlds. And among other things, what's noteworthy in Astor's novel is that he combines a very thorough, deep, articulate understanding of capitalistic economics, technological engineering and development, and a theistic or theological vision of the universe. And his characters go off journeying through the solar system, looking to colonize other planets. It's a very interesting novel where the scientific and religious are combined together. And as I mentioned, it's the first best-selling science fiction book in America. But the person who becomes most significant in the early history of science fiction is H.G. Wells, who's usually identified as the father of modern science fiction toward the end of the 19th, early 20th century. But he also could be seen as the father of modern future studies, because not only did he write a whole slew of very popular, influential science fiction novels like The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau, which, by the way, is much more gruesome and much more into bioengineering than Frankenstein was. The Sleeper Awakes, and The Shape of Things to Come, The Invisible Man. But he also would end up writing lots of books on what today we would call future studies, because in fact, he integrated the two in his mind. After, in the early part of his career, he wrote all of these science fiction novels, he turned his attention to writing about the study of the future and how that could be a scientific discipline, beginning with Anticipations and then The Discovery of the Future and Mankind in the Making, in which he speculated on how one could have a discipline, how can make predictions about the future. From The Discovery of the Future comes one of the great quotes in the history of science fiction and future studies, I think, from Wells. It is possible to believe that all that the past is but the beginning of a beginning, and that all that is and has been is but the twilight of the dawn. It is possible to believe that all that the human mind has ever accomplished is but the dream before the awakening. We are just beginning. And later on, after his first wave of science fiction, he wrote quite a few utopian nonfiction books and studies of the nature of human society and visions of how we can move to a global society in the future. A noteworthy thing, though, about Wells was that he came to believe that the only way to get from where we are now to a better global reality, a better world, is through some kind of global cataclysmic war. That this civilization we live in now, in some manner or form, needs to fall apart first before we can rebuild to something better. And that shows up in The World Set Free, that shows up in The Shape of Things to Come, and it shows up in other writings of his as well, too, The Open Conspiracy. So Wells wrote science fiction, he wrote about the future, he combined the two together. The Shape of Things to Come is a beautiful example, extremely intellectually powerful, uniting together speculations on the future, predictions on the future, with a systematic study of history and contemporary human society. So great mind, great influence. Now, I have up here a slide on Postcards from the Future. And these were created toward the end of the 19th century. And they're visions of the future. And one thing to note, and I already introduced Robita on this, is modern science fiction is a strong connection with visualization and art. And so part of the power of science fiction is the fact that it engages in visualization and art. And these images in general seem to be technologically oriented, having different technological devices and vision, and is creating some kind of better world than the world we exist in today. Notice down there in the left-hand corner, we have students sitting at desks where information is being pumped into their heads through headphones. Now, as positive visionary stuff, obviously people thought the future could be great. The future was going to be different. In fact, early World's Fairs in the beginning of the 20th century highlighted the wonders of progress and how things were advancing. But when we actually hit the 20th century, it doesn't quite turn out that way. Because the early decades of the 20th century, there were great accomplishments. There was the invention of flight and mass production, and the spread of the telephone, and then the radio, and the creation of skyscrapers, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a lot of sound and fury, a lot of war and mayhem and poverty and deprivation. There was jazz on one hand and Picasso's cubistic paintings, which challenged tradition. So the future did not emerge as some kind of utopian Pollyannish dream that we had had back from the previous century. It was disconcerting. It was filled with unsettledness. It was a disturbing of the peace. And science fiction in the early 20th century definitely represented this. because in science fiction, we find dystopias, we find disasters, we find adventures. We do not always just simply find kind of utopian visions of a world that has been improved through science and technology. We find an awful lot of chaos envisioned amidst the realities that humans will populate in the future. I want to just highlight a couple things here. First of all, early in the 20th century, we find some classic dystopias. Jack London in The Iron Heel in 1908 provides a dystopia that's a critique of capitalism and why capitalism is leading to disaster. In The Messiah of the Cylinder by Victor Rousseau, we find a dystopia of the future in which it is science that is going to lead to disaster. And City of Endless Night by Milo Hastings, we find the prediction made in the 1920 in fact, that Germany is going to create an authoritarian, destructive system of government and aggression that is going to attempt to conquer the world, which is a prediction literally in ways of the rise of Nazism in the next 20 years after that. But the two most famous dystopias, the two best of the early 20th century, are We, which is the first novel that the Soviet Union censored in their country, written by one of their own citizens, Yevgeny Zamyatin. And We is an incredibly fascinating novel. Here's a quote, which might at first not make any sense, but when you got to think about it a bit. The ancient God created an ancient human capable of mistakes, and therefore he made a mistake himself. The multiplication table is wiser. And what was, I can't see. Wiser, more absolute than the ancient God. It never, you understand, it never makes mistakes, and there is nothing happier than digits living according to the well-constructed eternal laws of the multiplication table. Zamyatin envisions a future world in this novel in which the human mind has become mathematical, orderly, communal, and integrated to the absolute degree, and personality, soul, imagination have all been eliminated. It is a veiled critique of the rise of communism, but it's also a strange kind of novel in that you get a real sense of what a different kind of human mind would be like in a different kind of human society. And in the end, you wonder, is this a dystopia or is this a utopia that is so dissonant with our present way of thinking that we have trouble with it psychologically? We find it very abhorrent. Well, the other famous dystopia written in the early part of the 20th century was Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is often listed as one of the 10 or 20 best novels ever written in the English language. And Brave New World is a synthesis of ideas drawn from popular culture, from Sigmund Freud, from Pavlov and classical conditioning, and mostly from Henry Ford and mass production, because in this future reality, humans are mass produced and they're biologically engineered along the way. It's an attempt to critique H.G. Wells. I won't go into that in any more detail, but Huxley wrote this in response to Wells's visions of utopias. And this is another ambiguous dystopia, because in the end, where the confrontation takes place between one of the leaders of this new world and someone who still believes in the values of old, it's not clear who wins the debate. Whether this world envisioned by Huxley is actually terrible or is actually better? And that's an important thing to consider when we think about preferable futures. It may seem obvious what's better and what's worse, but reading science fiction visions of the future, especially dystopia utopias, gives us a chance to ponder and think about, well, is this good or is this not good? During this same period, we get the first really great science fiction movie, Metropolis. And Metropolis is many, many different things. It was the most expensive movie ever made up to that point in time. It contains the first really powerful image of the robot, who becomes an archetype, an icon within science fiction, turns out to be a female robot. And the robot symbolizes both our fear of turning into machines or a fear of machines gaining control of us. It's a very religious and Dionysian vision too, because there's religious symbolism in it, religious ceremonies, coupled together with this vision of a techno-empowered reality. This is one of the really great science fiction movies of all time. Has a lot of biblical symbolism as well. And if you have never seen Metropolis, you could watch the whole thing, the reconstructed version on YouTube, and I would highly recommend it, because even though it appears as a dystopia, a world that's controlled by science and technology, it's also a world in which we have an upper class and we have a lower class, which is a critique that runs through lots of dystopias regarding how do we ever get rid of that. So anyway, highly recommended. Came out in the 1930s. Did not go over very well at first, but has become one of the classic science fiction movies of all time. Right around the same time the Metropolis comes out, we have a character who immigrates from Luxembourg. His name is Hugo Gernsberg, and Hugo Gernsberg is a great believer in the potential power and future of science and technology. And here's a quote from a book about Gernsberg. Gernsberg's genius was in identifying a purpose in science fiction, a means of creating tomorrow. Gernsberg brought science to the general public, and he sold it to those people a vision that the creation of tomorrow was in their hands. They could build the future. Gernsberg believed in self-empowerment. He believed in the America as the land of opportunity. And he saw this literature that was emerging as a way both to entertain and educate people on the future of science and technology. And in fact, he created, through his efforts over time, a whole series of different magazines, beginning with Modern Electrics, and then the Electrical Experimenter, and then Science and Invention, and then Amazing Stories, and then Science Wonder Stories, in which he increasingly publicized narratives of the future involving advancing science and technology. And he is the person responsible for popularizing the term science fiction. He didn't invent it, but nobody was using it until he started to use it. And it's a very funny story of why he ended up using that expression. Gernsberg is a challenge to futurists because Ralph 124C 41 Plus, that's the title of this novel he wrote back in 1911, contains in it hundreds of predictions about the future of technology, many of which have come true. It's a terribly boring and simplistic novel, but it's filled with predictions about the future that are pretty well spot on. So Gernsberg believed that science and technology were going to transform the world. We needed a literature that would stimulate people into thinking about it. And indeed, that literature in Gernsberg's mind was science fiction, which he gave the name to. And that was in the end of the 1920s into the 1930s. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, we also see the emergence of something that is still with us, the space opera. And the great architect of this was Doc Smith. And Doc Smith envisioned these great adventures in outer space with gigantic spaceships and incredible wars and ongoing conflict of good versus evil, where there were evil aliens manipulating humanity and cyborgs, where humans combined together with these techno lenses that they wore on their wrists and were able to have all kinds of psychic powers through them. And I bring up Doc Smith because he is, in fact, the origins of the whole Star Wars, Star Trek type of modern science fiction. He's the one who really created that kind of scenario, that general scenario of adventures in outer space and aliens and battles with aliens and good aliens and bad aliens, et cetera, et cetera. And he did it on a colossal scale, where in the end, we have planets, stars, even galaxies being blown up. Immense battles. These are being written in the late 1920s into the 1930s, right around the time that humanity is about ready to enter into World War II. But right around the same time, we find Olaf Stapleton, who was not a PhD in chemistry like Doc Smith was. Rather, Stapleton was a PhD in philosophy. And Stapleton didn't just envision colossal battles in outer space. Stapleton envisioned the entire history of the universe and the history of humanity. In fact, we have up here a quote from the Christian Science Monitor. Besides his Stapleton's stupendous panorama, his vision of worlds and galaxies, of cosmos piled on cosmos, the glimpses of the future that Mr. Wells and others have provided for us are no more than penny peep shows. And in fact, especially in Last and First Men and Star Maker, which were written in the 1930s, Stapleton set sail billions of years into the future, imagined the future history of humanity through 18 different future species, and in Star Maker, imagined the future history of intelligence in the universe. And Star Maker, Arthur C. Clarke has referred to as probably the most powerful work of imagination ever written. As far as I know, it is the most imaginative or powerfully imaginative work written in Western civilization. Now, there may be something I'm not aware of, but I'm not aware of anything that attempts the scale of imagination that Star Maker shows. So Stapleton takes a cosmic perspective on humanity and on the universe and helps us realize cosmic consciousness in the context of science fiction. And that's just a prelude to World War II. And here we are, World War II, where there's disaster again. And right at the same time, we have this vision from the New York World's Fair in 1939 of a future world that's wondrous and spectacular. But right at that very time, Hitler is getting ready to attack and invade Poland. So we have, again, both hope and fear with respect to our future. Things falling apart, but we're envisioning something fantastic in the future. It is in this context that we get the emergence of the golden age of science fiction. Now, up here is one of the most famous characters in science fiction, painted by one of the most famous science fiction artists, Michael Whelan. And the character up here is the Mule. And the Mule is from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, which was written during the 1940s. And the Mule is the black swan, the fly in the ointment toward a predictable future. And we'll come to that in a moment, but it has certain contemporary overtones to it for sure. People of the gold, oops, something went wrong there. Just hold on a second. The slide slipped. Okay. Writers of the Golden Age, with John Campbell as the editor of Astounding leading the way, envision different types of futures with the idea that somehow or other, we were going to be able to succeed, evolve, advance, and through challenges. In Slan, we have envisions of evolved humans that are different than us. In Robert Heinlein, we have a future history, and Heinlein was the most popular writer of the Golden Age, the most influential writer of the Golden Age, and Heinlein combined the scientific, technological with the political. Jack Williamson and the humanoids envisions a world of subservient robots that takes care of humans and does everything for us and turns into a disaster. And Isaac Asimov, down there on the right-hand side with his Foundation series, envisions a future galactic empire that is falling apart, and someone is able to show how you can make predictions about the future, long-term future, and predicts that if we do a certain set of things, the disaster coming at us will not take that long to, not that long, thousands of years. But what's unpredicted in this is an individual who gains control of large areas of our galaxy and unsettles all of the predictions of the future, the black swan, who is the mule. And I know I'm sort of getting close to the time being up, so I'm going to move along. Another famous dystopia during World War II and the Golden Age was 1984. And I have up here Brave New World and 1984 together because there's an interesting contrast. Brave New World is a world with no pain. 1984 is a world envisioned with no pleasure. And it's embodying a fear of authoritarianism and totalitarianism that was very powerful in World War II due to the fact of the rise of Nazism and communism as well too. And so a thing to point out right here regarding the evolution of science fiction, which we could trace all the way back to the early utopias, is in fact that science fiction doesn't just deal with the technological, and it deals with the social and other dimensions of the future as well too. In the 1950s, something significant happens, which is science fiction really explodes on the screen. War of the Worlds, which came out in 1953, which is a variation off of H.G. Wells' novel, was one of the popular movies that came out, but a lot of really good science fiction movies emerged in the 1950s. But a lot of great literature emerged too. A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a vision of what happens after World War III, The Man in the High Castle, which is a vision of what if Japan and Germany had won World War II, Childhood's End, Arthur C. Clarke, which envisions the future evolution of humanity past our present species, The Space Merchants, which is a critique of commercialism, The Demolished Man, which is a vision of a future in which the police are telepathic, very good. And that was the first novel to win the Hugo Award. Dune, which has stayed with us for decades and decades, and now they've redone a new movie of it. And there's also poetical and lyrical and great writing and imaginative writing going on, like Cornwainer Smith with the Ballad of Lost Camel, in which we have a future in which animals and humans are genetically combined, and the very lyrical Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. By the end of the Silver Age, we have the emergence of Star Trek and the emergence of Star Trek conventions coming in later on. And we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes, but science fiction really blossoms in the 1950s into the 1960s. And in case you're interested, this is a good resource for you on reading a lot of the great stories from the 1930s through the early 1960s, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. Lots of the stories that I'm just briefly alluding to could be found in that reference set. Now, the A-bomb has been hanging over our heads. Disaster has been hanging over our heads throughout the 1950s, even into the 1960s. And we do have a pop culture response to it. And the pop culture response to it was the counterculture and the hippies and sex and drugs and rock and roll, and an attack, an all-out attack, at least in the United States and other parts of the Western world, on our Western visions of progress and science. And look at the world that we have today, and we're just about ready to blow ourselves up. And so there was a lot of thinking, not just simply on science and technology, but on our values, our culture, during the 1960s by then. And it was during this time, and this is an example of how science fiction is influenced by culture, we get the new wave, dangerous visions, which is an attempt to be very inventive at a psychological and cultural level in science fiction. We get erotic, taboo, blasphemous, lyrical, metaphorical, psychedelic, maniacal, and catastrophic visions emerging in science fiction during this time. And those are some illustrations from the art. I think the best novel to emerge during this was Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner, which is a very good prescient vision written toward the end of the 1960s on the future of humanity, but in a very modern or postmodern kind of style. Postmodern would be the better word for it. Lots of stuff emerges in the new wave, affected by the new culture. Disasters, J.G. Ballard, The Drowned World, The Burning World. Visions of that challenge religious orthodoxy, like Behold the Man. Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and The Death Bird. Science fiction becoming much more sexually explicit and Flesh and the Lovers. Critiques on war, like Slaughterhouse-Five and The Forever War. But importantly, above everything else, the emergence of science fiction women writers, Ursula Le Guin and James Tiptree Jr., and many, many other ones. So science fiction reflects here the feminist movement in the 1960s and 70s, and women emerge as a powerful force. Now, at this point, I should mention that obviously by the 1960s and 70s and moving forward, and I outlined this in Contemporary Futurist Thought, there's lots of futurist visions, lots of theories of the future coming up in future studies. And I have up here just a sampling of books that through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, up to now, have emerged with different theories of the future. And we don't agree as futurists among ourselves as to what the preferable future is or how to even to think about the future. We have certain things that a lot of us do agree on, but there's also lots of dissent as well. And what we in fact have is we have something like a collective and interactive evolution of future consciousness going on between all these different ideas. But in the midst of this interactive, pluralistic reality in future studies, by the 1980s, we have science fiction conquering the world. And what that means is that by the 1980s, and from that way up to the present, all of the biggest money-making movies have been by far science fiction. That is, science fiction came to dominate the media. And the media is the most pervasive, influential form of communication among humanity. And science fiction took over. And science fiction, of course, impacted people's thinking in many, many different ways throughout history. But with the emergence of Star Wars and E.T. and Terminator, and then all the other ones that come later, it began to really dominate our public consciousness. The dreams our stuff is made of. Science fiction is the dreams that our stuff, our material world is made of. And in fact, there's an illustration of this in the I gotta talk about this slide first. Here's a picture of the central characters from the TV series, The Big Bang. And these four characters are dressed up in science fiction, in this case here, Star Trek outfits, going to a Star Trek convention. but they're walking through the desert because they've had their car stolen. But the thing about these characters up here, Sheldon on the left there especially, is that science fiction has become a way of life for them. They live it, they breathe it. They have science fiction paintings and games and books and contraptions in their household. They go to comic book conventions. They talk about science fiction. Science fiction is really in their blood. It becomes a way of life for them. In fact, it becomes a paradigm for living and understanding reality in the future. And to illustrate that, and this is an important point to consider, these are just some images I took off of the web of people at science fiction conventions. Vastly more people in the world attend science fiction conventions than futurist conventions. It's not even close. The number of people going, and that includes the comics, because comics are science fiction most of the time too. The number of people runs into the millions, and it's not even just in the United States, it's globally. In terms of impact and in terms of dressing up and playing the roles, of becoming part of one's life. Popular science fiction clearly overpowers by far the influence of future studies. This is where people are getting their images, their ideas of the future from. And they're socially participating in it. As a very powerful example of this, in the 1980s, cyberpunk emerged with the publication of William Gibson's Neuromancer. And cyberpunk envisioned a reality that was computer dominated, that was definitely into virtual reality on top of it all. And cyberpunk as a form of science fiction powerfully worked itself into modern Western culture. We live in a reality that has lots of cyberpunk imagery in it and lots of cyberpunk ideas. Cyberpunk influenced popular culture tremendously. Now, moving into the 90s, and I'm coming toward the end, obviously. A couple of things to highlight in the 90s. Oops. This is an image of the Shrike, and the Shrike is a central character in Dan Simmons' Hyperion's Contest, which is 4 novels that came out in the 90s up until the early part of the 21st century. And the Hyperion Cantos or series, I will often mention to people when they tell me they don't like science fiction. And I'll say, read this, because in these 4 novels, we find discussions of immortality, stellar networks, philosophers, poets, nanotechnology, biotechnology, time travel, infinite ecology, supercomputers, the rise and fall of civilizations, religion, virtual reincarnation, the second coming, archetypes of good and evil, including the Dalai Lama and the Grand Inquisitor and just about everything else. That is, in the Hyperion series, we find a world of the future of everything integrated together and written by a man who has an incredible imagination and literary ability. It is a really full-blown integrative understanding of the future. And it's a very thoughtful and imaginative one. So science fiction doesn't deal with just the future of science and technology. It deals with the future of everything. And Hyperion's an example, but in the 90s, we find a whole slew of other really high-powered, it did it again on me. It jumps, yes, excuse me. Okay, we find quite a number of really high-powered science fiction novels that create visions of the future of everything. The Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars series, the River of Gods that takes place in future India, the Diamond Age, A Fire Upon the Deep, which deals with a future Milky Way in which a galactic level computer virus gets loose and starts to spread across the galaxy. Queen of Angels, about future psychotherapy and a future division in humanity between the enhanced and the unenhanced. Watchmen, an alternative reality. All of these are big, detailed, intricate visions of the future. In fact, Stephen Baxter in Vacuum Diagrams tells a history of the future that goes out millions of years into the future and millions of years going into the past. And in the Time Ships, which is a sequel to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, Stephen Baxter is able to pull off a future history of everything. In a sense, sort of going up to the same level as Olaf Stapleton did. So science fiction is ideal literature that challenges the intellect. A lot of these books are very intricate and challenging to read, but extremely imaginative about the future of everything. And then science fiction, in fact, by now has acquired this scholarship. Lots of study goes on in science fiction, lots of collections of classic books in science fiction. Yeah. It's turned into an area of intellectual self-consciousness. People study it, people talk about it. And that definitely is emerging by the 90s. Now we're coming to the last millennium. We're almost done. Okay, sorry, I'm going over a little bit here. Computers and AI and the vision of the singularity are still with us in 21st century science fiction. Robert Sawyer's Wake, what would happen if the web became self-conscious, woke up? Mind Scan, what would happen if you could download your consciousness into another brain? Accelerando, what if computers exceed the power of humans and we got to take off and get the hell out of the solar system? Great novel, written, I swear, on speed. Permutation City and Diaspora, future histories of humanity going virtual. The rapture of the nerds, waiting for a new heaven that's in virtual reality. So the singularity, AI, virtual reality, virtual minds have all stayed very popular and interesting themes in the 20th century, 21st century in science fiction. But at the other end of things, we have this amazing, incredible, bizarre series written by China Miéville, the Perdido Street Station trilogy, which takes place in an alternate reality and is as imaginative and different as one could possibly conceptualize. And he's part of what in science fiction is now called the new weird. And something to point out about science fiction here is that science fiction keeps evolving. And we have this strange city called New Krubazan, and we have somebody who studies thaumaturgy. We have slake moths and the devil and dream shit, which is a form of drug. And we have a being which is half insect and half human. You got to read this to believe it. But this is the outer edge of imagination in science fiction, not about computers so much, but about a totally different alternate reality. The Evolving Edge, Ted Chiang, who's written a lot of great stories, Jeff Vandermeer, the Annihilation Authority Acceptance series, N.K. Jemisin, who's won the Hugo Nebula for her series on the 5th season, and Annie Leckie. And in the middle, I have in there The Three-Body Problem by Zhen Liu, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, or Liu Zhen. This was a novel written in China, was translated into English 10 years after it was written in China. He is the most popular contemporary Chinese science fiction writer. And this won the Hugo as the best science fiction novel of the year when it was finally published in English. And it's part of a trilogy that everybody recommends to everybody. You got to read it if you want to read contemporary science fiction. And I have here a quote: China is dreaming, and its dreams contain multitudes. Science fiction has spread across the globe, and science fiction, in fact, has become increasingly popular in China. And Zhen Liu and the Three-Body Problem series, highly recommended, read it. And it has to do with a simple question: is it a good idea to send signals into outer space, telling outer space and whoever might be out there that we're down here and we want to communicate with you? What might happen if that goes really wrong? And they made it into a movie, but it's in Chinese. I haven't seen it. Into the 21st century, we get a continual onslaught of science fiction movies, most popular movies of the last 2 decades. And everyone up here is just another collage I kept putting up a year later. It just never ends up to the last couple of years. And like Terry mentioned, I have a list of best science fiction movies up on the screen. I've only highlighted it briefly, but science fiction has moved into the TV as well. And we've had a lot of stuff on science fiction TV. In fact, some of the best stuff the last year or two has been produced on TV. The Expanse, great space opera, excellent Alien, another Star Trek iteration. They keep making more and more Star Treks. Watchmen, which is a variation on the original Watchmen series, and not series, book. But in this case here, we have a really good perspective, maybe the best cinematic perspective on the Black experience in a science fiction context. So science fiction has definitely come onto TV, continues on TV. I haven't said too much about it, but science fiction art, and here's the illustrations of it, the visual dimension of science fiction has continued to evolve through the decades. Videos, interactive science fiction, people playing video games, half of which, if not 2/3 or more, are science fiction. Science fiction is part of our video culture. In fact, Ready Player One was a science fiction novel based upon science fiction videos that was made into a science fiction movie, moving through 3 different genres there. The popularity of science fiction. It's the most visible, popular, influential form of futurist thinking because it engages all different aspects of the future. It generates total person immersion, stimulates all aspects of human consciousness, creates holistic future consciousness. It's future's narrative, and we resonate with the story much more than with the theory. That's why science fiction is so popular, because it's stories, but stories provide identity, meaning, value, they engage. And in fact, through science fiction stories, we not only think about the future, we live and feel it. If vicariously still, we live and feel it, which is critical. And here's a definition that I've used. It's a narrative approach to the future involving plots, etc., settings, dramas, and unique characters, human and otherwise, inspired to a great degree by modern science and contemporary thought. It's imaginative and highly detailed scenario building and thought experiments about the future set in the form of stories and more. But there's more, because science fiction gets into alternate realities, which are not exactly about the future. So it stimulates and evolves holistic future consciousness. It creates a total way of life, a paradigm for the future through narratives on the future, of the future. And just as the last slide, why do I call it the evolutionary mythology of the future? The future ain't what it used to be, and it never was. Science fiction emerged out of myth, out of fantastical myth. That's its foundation. It has an evolutionary cumulative heritage. It keeps building on itself. People have asked me frequently about writing science fiction. I said, well, if you're going to write it, you should read it, because if you think you got an interesting idea, probably somebody came up with it before. So it builds on itself. It's a reflective think tank. The writers and fans in science fiction continually talk to each other about stories, novels, and the future. It is framed by the theory of cosmic evolution, that the universe is this big evolving cosmos, and we're part of it, but it's a double dramatic sword. It's got danger in it as well as hope and mystery and all of the good stuff and the bad stuff. And to illustrate, I have up here 3 famous novels about the future of humanity, or future humanity. H.G. Wells in 1895, Imagining Humanity, 800,000 years in the future, with the separation of the upper class and the lower class, the Eloys and the Morlocks, with the lower class eventually eating the upper class. And Last and First Men, written in the 1930s, involving genetic engineering and purposeful evolution of our minds and bodies in future species. And then Diaspora, which is written in about 1995, envisioning that we become first robots, our minds go into machines, and then we become virtual minds. We no longer even have a permanent body, and we can materialize in whatever form we want. So, in fact, our visions of future humanity have been evolving through the history of science fiction. So science fiction is an evolving expression of future consciousness. It's purposely facilitating the evolution of humanity. We get our ideas from it and we attempt to apply them to us. And it purposely facilitates the evolution of our future consciousness. So this is just a summary of what I talked about, and I don't need to go over it because I have gone over a bit. But what is the value of science fiction in understanding the future and guiding us into the future? We can talk about the other questions that you may have up in the chat, but I'm going to stop sharing right now. Sorry, I went over 15 minutes, but I did. Okay. So anyway, that's the presentation. So let's see. Could people hear me?
Yes, Tom, people can hear you.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Okay, you have, and Crystal and Greg, you're still there. Good. I apologize, I went over. Put your questions. What is one major myth that turned out to be true? And is there any myths that changed history? Yes, that's a good question. Well, the one myth I think we worry about the most that may turn out to be true is that we destroy ourselves in some great war. Yeah. Are there any myths that have changed history? I think all of these myths have had an impact on history, on the way we look at things. For example, okay, and I'm going to use, this one is a very powerful one. If I tell you that after you die, you're going to go to a better place, a higher place, and this myth shows up in lots of different world religions, and even if you suffer here, in the end, you're going to be rewarded for your suffering. That's going to have a big impact on how you live this life versus if you were told that this is it, and you better make the best of it here because there ain't no better world in the next one. And that has had a powerful impact on people's behavior, on government, even government behavior. And let me think about one major myth that turned out to be true. Let me think about that one some more. The Last Man in part was based on Malthus's essay on population, which is where the idea was presented that our population is increasing faster than our resources, and in the end, we're going to use up our resources. Where does one put non-supernatural, but not future storytellers, either, unless I missed something? Gerald asked, where does one put Democritus? My answer, Gerald, is that they are philosophers, secular philosophers, scientific philosophers. Lucretius and Democritus, I would imagine, have I would imagine they have they had a great impact on the evolution of secular philosophy and science. Can customs and traditions limit our future consciousness? Absolutely. They shape it. If being a cyber becomes our new norm, would that aid in our consciousness evolution or be an obstacle? Hannah, we already are cyborgs. We are technologically enhanced in many different ways already, even though a lot of our technologies aren't hooked onto or embedded into our body yet, but in fact, we already are cyborgs. Now, is that going to help us or hurt us? That's an issue. Do technologies enfeeble us or do they empower us? And I think the answer is going to be, well, maybe they do both at the same time. For example, you might not consider this, but if you were a visitor from another planet, you might have this thought. Oh, here are these biological entities that put themselves into these bigger mechanical devices which provide enhanced mobility for themselves. They're able to move around a lot faster and at greater distances because they have this exoskeleton that they put on and they sit in. Now, as a result of that, we become empowered. So we don't have to walk to downtown or wherever. We can get there a lot faster. But at the same time, because we sit in these exoskeletons all the time, we become lazier and less physically fit because we're not walkers like we were before so much. Now we move around in our automobiles, which are techno exoskeletons. And an automobile is part of our cyborg nature, just like what we're doing right now. This is cyborg. This is all cyborg. We couldn't do anything close to this without these machines that are both visualizing us and transmitting our images and our ideas across space and time. Gerald mentions Margaret Cavendish. Yes, which I have, Gerald. I haven't read it yet. Do you think, I think I answered the questions about why is science fiction so popular? Again, because it's stories and the human mind resonates to the story. The human mind resonates to concrete characters. When I give you a theory of the future, that doesn't tap into the human storytelling inclinations and mindset of humans. Tell me a story about the future and put in some interesting characters and give it drama, emotion, action, and then people resonate into it. And that's why myths, to begin with, people resonated into back thousands of years ago. Yes, it is possible. In fact, go back to that opening slide. Everything is looking more like science fiction, and science fiction is looking more like everything else. We live in a science fiction reality from the perspective of Hugo Gernsberg. That is, the reality we're in right now is pieces of realities that were envisioned by science fiction writers before. And science fiction impacts our culture in the sense that it gives us scenarios and visions and ideas that become part of how we see things, how we live. It is possible if flight ever became the new most important, what pros compensate? Yeah. Do you believe that the past predictions about the future, regarding predictions about the future, there's lots of predictions about the future which are not correct, but we're missing the obvious. And the obvious is that humans make lots of predictions about the future that come out true. Lots of predictions. Because if we didn't, our whole way of reality would fall apart. So I predict that the sun will rise tomorrow. Okay? I predict that I turn on my faucet, water will come out. I predict that when I drop an object, it'll fall to the ground. I predict that if I say, hello, Terry, she will respond. Now, sometimes things can go wrong with the predictions, but all of those short-term concrete types of predictions, most of the time come true. When I walk, I'm assuming that the floor and the ground is going to continue to be there. That's anticipating things about the future. The machine stops, great story, yes. Gerald put that one up. I see Immanuel Kant's book. He believed that space and time are ineffable, I believe. Yes, I'd have to go back and read that one. I'm going to go back and read that one. I'm not a philosopher, but I think. And let me see, from students. China's produced some, yes, I got, okay. Tom put together these lists. Thank you for great, thank you, Tom, very interesting. We associate have very, yes, okay. Anybody want to ask questions here? Or we got to cut off, don't we, Crystal and Gray? How we doing? There's still people up here, actually.
Yes, we're actually approaching this as long as there's people still in the discussion, we'll keep it on unless you have to sign out for the morning.
Yeah, for anyone who has to go, of course, you can. You don't have to stay here, but if you still have questions, then as long as Dr. Lombardo is okay with staying and answering them, then yeah, there's no limit on this.
Doctor, I have a question. If you could please answer it.
Yeah.
My question is, you said that, I believe you said that the best way that we could have future consciousness is by scientific fiction or science fiction. Isn't it scientific method? Is it? I believe it's better to have a future consciousness with a scientific method, not with the science fiction. Because not everything on the science fiction is going to turn out to be true or is going to happen in the future. But the best way to look at the future, I believe, with scientific method. And I believe there's a big difference between scientific method and science fiction.
Yes, there's a couple comments I'd make on that. I did not say that the best way to look at the future was through science fiction. I said that science fiction is the most influential and powerful way to that we look at the future. In terms of our culture, in terms of our human society, it has a bigger impact. And the reason why it has a bigger impact is because of its narrative, concrete form, for one thing. Also, science fiction incorporates into it science. So it's not like science and science fiction are bipolar opposites or different things. Rather, science fiction is to a great degree science-informed fiction. Not entirely, but to a great degree. Third, the scientific method, if you mean by that,
I mean by that, Doctor, the research topic area, the hypothesis, the test with the experiment, analysis, report, conclusion, observation, the question. I mean, that's what I mean by saying, how can we look at the future if we can't have it, if we can't test an experience?
Yeah, I'm not, let's see, I'm trying to get a handle on, I'm not disagreeing with you in that, let's see, if I want to get if I want to enhance my understanding of the future, my consciousness of the future, how would I do that through the scientific method? Now, there's two parts to this question. On the other hand, if I were to say, how would I do that with science fiction? I would say, well, why don't you read a set of diverse stories about the future? Look at what these different people envision and why they envision it. And that's going to stimulate your consciousness with a set of different possibilities that may seem very, that have degrees of plausibility. And if you're reading the author is going to be explaining along the way in different ways why they're suggesting this or why they think that. Now, the scientific method does provide with hypothesis testing a way to, in fact, predict the future. In fact, I go back to the thing I said about we predict the future a lot. In fact, in science, in essence, that's what we're doing all the time. So if I'm formulating a particular hypothesis, a general theory, I'm going to be making predictions about the future, testing those predictions out, even if it's going to be a short-term future. And if the predictions are confirmed, I indeed have been developing my understanding of the future. So like Newton's laws of physics, which presumably were developed through the scientific method, provide a way for us to predict the behavior of the solar system, as well as aspects of the universe at large, indefinitely into the future. But what Newton doesn't do is he doesn't provide you with a diversity of different perspectives and different concrete scenarios of different possible future realities. But that isn't to say that science fiction won't derive stories from science and what science does. So I'm agreeing with you that science does predict the future, that using the scientific method is a sound way to go about it in predicting the future. But what science fiction adds into it is that it takes scientific ideas and it imaginatively constructs different possibilities out of them. It may actually call into question certain scientific ideas at times too. So I'm not going to dispute that science isn't a way to predict the future, for sure. I'm just thinking that out loud as you asked the question, I was just thinking out loud what my thoughts would be on it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, right. I see Gerald. Hello, Gerald. You're up there still. Yeah. Good to see you. Other comments? Yes, that's it, right?
I think T. Connolly had a question, but it came to me, and it reads, or his comment is, or her comment reads, I agree with the questioning, the influence of science fiction. It may be widely read, but there is a difference between readership and impact, aside from some great works.
I guess I don't understand the question.
I think it's just a comment about impact.
Well, can you hear me? I'm Tom Connolly.
Oh, hi, Tom. Okay.
Hi.
Yes,
Hi.
I can see you.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Earlier, I made a comment about contemporary writers insisting on calling it speculative fiction rather than science fiction. And I think this is linked to my question about I dispute the correlation between massive readership and massive impact. I think there's a problem with the perception, in literature, in literary studies, if you will, of, the value of science fiction, whereas in society, the conversation we're having right now, it's very great, but I don't know in terms of on an academic level or in a philosophical level, it has that kind of impact.
Let's see. There was a couple pieces to what you said. Oh, okay. Yeah, let me just go back. I'm familiar with the expression speculative fiction, which became popular back a few decades ago, at least, maybe more, to provide a more encompassing umbrella for what was written within what is called science fiction. Because lots of times what is called science fiction may have very little science in it, but it definitely is speculative fiction. So in my mind, what I call science fiction is what other people have called speculative fiction, because I include in science fiction stories, novels that have psychological, ethical emphasis as opposed to technological emphasis. The second thing you said was that the amount of readership does not necessarily imply a certain level of impact. Well, no, it doesn't, except for the fact that we also have participation in science fiction events, which I brought up earlier, conventions, etc., where the amount of participation there seems to indicate that people are willing to participate in those events. So it obviously is going beyond just simply reading. My point being that earlier, that many more people come to science fiction conventions than come to science fiction, than go to futurist conventions. Now, you could dispute a nice, neat relationship between reading and impact, but I'd like to see how we would go about figuring that out. Assuming we have a great deal of readership, how do you go about measuring the impact based on that great deal of readership? And off the top of my head, it just seems to me that I see around me lots of illustrations in lots of different forms, what people talk about, how they communicate with each other, what you see on TV, in terms of the impact. Now, we have this whole dimension of popular culture, which people actively participate in, which is informed powerfully by science fiction. And that is the video dimension of popular culture. Now, so science fiction is clearly getting itself into something that people very actively participate in a lot with its imagery and its themes. But I agree with you that, I can't in any simple way say, well, because lots of people read it, that doesn't mean people aren't influenced by it. I mean, people, in fact, I think are influenced by it. But I don't know what studies we would use and how we would measure influence here. I'm saying they come to conventions, it's part of videos, it's in our language, we talk about it. Those are examples of being influenced by it. Oh, and also that people get inspired from it and work in the areas that are related to science and technology, who have clearly identified in the past many times over that they were influenced by their reading of science fiction. But you have a good point there too. What was your first name? Tom? Is that what it was?
Tom, yes, yes.
Tom, yes, Tom, yes.
I might see you. Are you going to Berlin?
Yes.
I'll see you there.
Good, Tom. Okay, I'll see you there. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, let me stick in a little small piece, which is, I think that science fiction, of the three, one science, one foresight, and the third science fiction is obviously the most successful in any numerical measure as far as its reach and what would be the right word, the comprehensibility of its messages. Science is a little more limited in that because there are plenty of people in science that don't read science fiction, especially serious people in professional roles. And foresight is kind of a nebulous area because, as we probably have all seen, what used to be a fairly esoteric discipline has become part of some little measure of just about everything that everybody does. People look forward a lot more than they did previously. And that's probably a measure of the impact of science fiction as well. But also, the possibility of better technology, so people can do what I would call large-scale data sets and manipulate them in ways that they weren't before. The growth of AI and the possibility that AI in foresight is going to become an increasing factor. I mean, I'm just doing this, just finished a written piece on AI in environmental change. People are using AI to integrate renewables into the energy networks that wasn't possible before. So things are consistently changing. Science fiction is getting more powerful, but it will never be that with everything. And neither will futures be that with everything, and neither will science be all composed of science fiction fans. Inner working, but not completely integrated.
Yeah. One question that popped into my head, a question that I think about or thought about in different ways, is what I refer to as our collective future consciousness evolving, increasing, enhancing across time. Whether it's at an individual level or at a collective level, are we becoming more expansive, flexible, conscious of, articulate with respect to the future and the possibilities of the future and how to think about it, and that we do think about it? That's a question that comes into my head.
Okay, but Tom, I would say in response that if you could figure out how to measure that, that's probably a Nobel Prize.
Yes, good, fine. But the question does come into my head. Okay, that one, all right. And what's impacting that, if indeed that is growing, changing, articulating? It's interesting you brought up AI because I would probably have to tunnel down a little more deeply into it, but it seems to me that the building blocks of the whole idea of AI emerge within the science fiction tradition and history of the past, that it has articulated, emerged out of that. It going back more than 100 years. So we have an idea that has become operationalized, very powerful and promising today. And if we were to trace back the history of that idea, that theme, we would find it having emerged and grown out of the history of science fiction. I mean, I got somebody I'll put up there, The Machine Stops, which is 120 years old. That's a form of artificial intelligence. And probably we can come up with a lot earlier examples as well. Actually, The Sandman, that's 200 years old, artificial intelligence envisioned in it. Robot, in this case. And collective artificial intelligence clearly in The Machine Stops, if not earlier. So these significant ideas today go back. Now, part of the problem here is maybe just the term science fiction. If I tell a story about the future, or a story about an alternate reality, or a story that's scientifically or technologically informed, I can call it all science fiction. And we've been doing that for thousands of years, little pieces of that, different pieces of it. We have the story of Icarus. That's 2,000 years old, which has science fiction elements in it. I could present the argument, and I don't know if he's still here, he might still be here, that what is the significance of the story? And I would suggest that if you want to influence people, if you want to have an impact on the direction of the future, you better have some good stories to tell. Now, you can give some studies, but the story is going to have probably a bigger impact on people collectively than, say, a study, a scientific study. Now, the scientific study may be accurate within the limits of accuracy, but the story is going to be psychologically much more impactful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I flip that? Which is that one, there's no argument, Tom, that science fiction can be inspirational, and that lots of things that people have described, wouldn't it be nice if, have been the driver for serious research and some practical outcomes. And if nothing else, the story of Icarus you mentioned certainly brings out the possibility that you should not use wax as a medium in a high temperature environment when you're trying to build wings. But I would think that it's very important when you're talking about science is that the difference between aspiration and operation. Operational challenges in AI have been extraordinary. We can just look at that excuse that IBM put together called Watson, and kind of it sort of did not realize its promise in my mind. I'm sure IBM would say something different. But the whole idea of the one concept we don't talk very much about is machine learning, which is going along gangbusters. And the real question will be, how much can machines teach it themselves? And will they shape their own future? That's pretty interesting.
Yes, it is very interesting. And whether I'm going to think about that philosophically, psychologically, scientifically, technologically, or in the form of a story, I'll go any direction on that. Yeah. At a fundamental level, the question could be, in what sense can a machine realize something that looks like self-consciousness? It assesses its own states and attempts to modify in various ways or improve in various ways its own psychological states. Yeah.
Sorry. I'm apologizing for smiling. I have a missing tooth that I'm getting replaced day after tomorrow.
Okay.
But you just raised the most interesting question, which is, can an AI write good science fiction?
Yes. Okay. Well, how about this one? Not write science fiction. And AI isn't working alone, independent of humans, but in this case here, AI and humans are coupled together. But last week, I received an email regarding a bunch of musicologists and computer people who have created Beethoven's 10th Symphony. And from notes that Beethoven left before he died, sketches of the 10th Symphony. And it's going to be performed. So it wasn't created just by AI, because right now AI doesn't stand alone. It can't sustain itself without humans there providing it with certain support conditions. But between the humans and the AI, they created the 10th Symphony from the notes. And when you hear it, you immediately think, if you know him, damn, that's Beethoven, all right. That's his style. That's his way, And so there's been lots of examples of this already, of AI being used to create poetry, to create art, to create music. And this last week, AI with humans created Beethoven's 10th Symphony. The creativity dimension to AI, to artificial intelligence, to computers, to robots, the debate, can they be creative, or at least as creative as humans? Because of course, how creative are we, for that matter? I think that, you know, we see indications that that's coming, or that has come. And can they learn on their own? Yes, we see indications of that too. Can they somehow functionally self-reflect and assess their own states and attempt to modify them and improve on themselves, which humans presumably can do, not very well half of the time, but do computers do that too? I think those are all things that, you know, you can think about philosophically, intellectually, have good discussions on, whether you're a psychologist, philosopher, an AI person, but you could also write stories on that too. Queen of Angels by Greg Bear, which was up on my slides. In there is a computer which is attempting to prove to itself that it exists and that it is conscious. It is like a Descartes version of the computer, where Descartes concludes he thinks, therefore he exists. This computer in Queen of Angels is attempting to do that very thing, to determine indeed that it is conscious, and does it exist as a conscious I, a me? And it is it's sort of an interesting philosophical conundrum, because can you imagine a mind attempting to answer that question to itself? Do I really exist? Am I conscious? It's an odd kind of question to ask yourself, you know. But for Descartes' point of view, the fact that I could ask the question means that I am, obviously. Yeah. Emma put up that Beethoven's 10th Symphony is a great work. Yes, it is. I like the beginning of the 10th Symphony.
Okay, now I have a response to that, which is the whole idea of compelling story. Are AIs ever going to be capable of compelling stories? And one of the measures of that would be if, without any notes, the same AI could write an 11th symphony, which was better than the 10th.
Yes. Okay. And my answer is going to be sooner or later, yes, because sooner or later, I think I'm in resonance with Greg Egan in Diaspora, that we are going to go consciousness embodied robotic, and then consciousness embodied virtual, that will happen. When it happens, I don't know. Okay. Now, I think I also go evolutionary like Kurzweil, in that I think, wait, here's how. The history of evolution seems to indicate that you can create something more complex out of the thing that came before. So I think it makes perfect sense from an evolutionary point of view that whatever comes as a result of us is going to transcend us. It's going to be more complex, more evolved, probably more unique than we are. And there's nothing cosmically bizarre about that, because that's what's been happening in history, the history of the universe. The future seems to be able to transcend the past. What comes later in the evolutionary saga goes beyond what came before. Yes, it will create the 11th symphony, which maybe will be better than the 10th or the 9th, whatever. Yeah, the 8th. Okay, Jeannie likes the 8th, by the way. Yes.
But it seems to me the other question is, and of course we haven't talked about that, is transhumanism, and all the people who want to upload themselves into computers and become an amalgam. You know, and the whole thing is, what is, you know, because you talked about Kurzweil, what is the next step when computers surpass humans? Will it be AI, or will it be some amalgam?
Yeah, there's all kinds of angles on that one. In fact, for people still watching, The Rapture of the Nerds is a good comical narrative on transhumanism and on uploading one's consciousness into machines and the transhumanist vision. So that's one to read there. In the original Singularity article by Vinci, he compared together the possibilities of in the evolution of technological augmentation of humans. Will there inevitably still be a human core, or as you keep augmenting more and more, will that human core become increasingly insignificant? That is, once you, so even the amalgam idea, if the thing takes, and it already has taken off, we're already augmenting ourselves in various ways. And the more we do, the less and less of this is going to be what we would call, and I don't want to use the word human, maybe that's not the right word, biologically, yeah, biologically human. So the end result may be the same either way. Whether we augment or replace, in the end we replace. But I want to think about that some more too, because maybe I think, like for example, what popped into my head was, we didn't eliminate the bacteria, we just incorporated them into our being. Okay, we transcended them, but they're still in us, and they're integral to us. So it's not like we got rid of them, like the computer, the AI would get rid of us. It may be that in some sense we would be like bacteria within something more complex. Yeah, I'm not, and that's a bad metaphor probably, but we
it's wonderful.
We did not get rid of the bacteria. We did not, you know, they're part of us. They were an evolutionary step toward us, and they were incorporated into us.
Right, and they digest our food.
Yes, they do lots of stuff. Yes, I know. Okay, well, let's see. That emotional subroutine, I think. Gerald's got some more comments here. AIs to write science fiction that will resonate with people will have to have some sort of emotional subroutine. Yes, Gerald. And visions feel better than others and be more pleasing and disgusting, but still stimulating. Okay, yeah. Now, yeah, AI is going to have an emotional dimension to its intelligence, like we do. Yes, it's got to be able to resonate with the dimensions of hope and fear and anger, and also even an aesthetic dimension to its intelligence of beauty and ugliness, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's part of the significance of fiction, of literature, that it has those dimensions in it. Now, I don't see any reason a priori why AI cannot have an emotional dimension and cannot have an aesthetic dimension as well too, or a creative dimension or a self-conscious dimension. All those factors I can see AI possessing, because there's no good argument yet for why a machine can't be conscious, because we can't figure out yet why it is that a biological system is conscious. We can show you lots of details of the physiology of it, but we can't explain what is this thing, consciousness, that emerges in this complex biological thing. What is it? It's there, it's obvious. So, but I can't explain to you how you go from neurons firing to feeling disgusted. Where's the feeling of disgusted come from, etc. Okay, well, we're probably.
I have to ask the question: is disgust the true nature of consciousness?
That's part of consciousness. Yes, part of consciousness is feeling titillated and erotic and smelling ravioli. Okay, all of those things are part of our consciousness, and somehow all of those things of consciousness, of which there is an incredible variety, including consciousnesses of other people, other conscious minds. Somehow or other that emerges out of this very complex bioecological network that we're in. How? You know, because if you look inside of the brain, you don't see the smell of ravioli anywhere in there. So how does that happen? Okay. So don't tell me you can't do it in a machine, because we can't figure out how we do it with a biological entity.
But it will be a long time before we see machines eating ravioli.
I don't know about that. I don't know. I don't know. You just make a machine that needs to consume carbohydrates for fuel. Maybe we'll want to eat the ravioli. You know, we get beyond. No, but actually, you know, the whole thing with Data on Star Trek, which is a very simple issue and a very important one, is Data wanted to feel. That was part of his experience that was missing, that he had the emotion chip. Okay, or you could have the a beauty. I don't want to say they could be like chips, but these certain dimensions of consciousness need to be there for a fully rich human experience, and it can't be just the intellect. That was the Romantics' response to the Enlightenment philosophers. You can't figure reality out just with the intellect. There's more to human reality than that. Yeah, and so our machines, our machine descendants. But how can you want without already having feelings?
How can you have machines that have feelings without the dark side of those feelings?
Maybe that's true. Yes, yes.
When we get to the Terminator movies.
Yeah, right. Maybe that's true. Gerald just asked, how can you want without already having feelings? Indeed, wanting as a fundamental descriptor for human motivation and feelings as a fundamental descriptor for human emotion, yes, those things come together, motivation and emotion. And that's part of the challenge with the machines here too. Well, anyway, we should probably stop. It's been